Imagine you're driving a car at, 80 miles an hour down the highway.
Yeah.
You feel completely in control. The radio's playing, the AC is on, you're making really good time.
Sounds like a great road trip, honestly.
Right. But here's the catch. You actually have no idea how the steering wheel in your hands connects to the tires on the road.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you don't know if it's a mechanical linkage or, I don't know, an electrical wire or just some psychological illusion. You are operating this massive high-speed machine in total ignorance of its underlying mechanics.
Well, under those conditions, I mean, a catastrophic crash isn't just a possibility. It's basically an absolute inevitability.
Exactly. And pulling over to open the hood of your own mind is what today's deep dive is all about.
It really is. And I mean, that car analogy is terrifying, but
Yeah.
it so accurately describes how the vast majority of people operate their own minds every single day.
Yeah, we make rapid-fire decisions about what is true, what is valuable, how we should treat other people, and we do it often without ever examining the underlying mechanics of those beliefs.
Right. So we are unpacking a fascinating lecture series today. It's titled A Brief Christian Introduction to Philosophy.
And the mission of this material is to demystify what can be a really intimidating subject.
Yeah.
It sets out to prove that every single person alive, yes, you listening to this right now, you are secretly a philosopher.
Whether you know it or not.
Exactly. You're going to see how human thought evolved from ancient Greece to modern times. And we'll look specifically at how the lecturer argues that a Christian worldview attempts to resolve these ultimate mind-bending paradoxes that have, well, crashed the cars of history's greatest thinkers.
I think the word philosophy usually conjures up these images of, old men in tweed jackets, smoking pipes in dusty libraries.
Debating things that have absolutely zero bearing on the real world.
Right. Exactly. But the lecture here completely strips away all of that academic pretension. The material just starts by defining the term from its Greek roots. So philo, meaning love, and Sophia, meaning wisdom.
It's simply the love of wisdom.
Yeah. And the framework of this specific lecture series immediately anchors that pursuit of wisdom in a theological claim. It references the biblical book of Colossians chapter 2, verse 3.
Right, and it operates on the premise that all treasures of wisdom and knowledge are ultimately deposited in Christ, which is, a massive foundational claim right out of the gate.
It really is. The lecturer approaches this entire history of human thought from the perspective that a Christian framework provides the only cohesive lens for doing philosophy successfully.
But before the material even attempts to prove that claim, it asks a much more practical question, like, what does a philosopher actually do?
Well, the series outlines that philosophy deals with the absolute bedrock foundations of human knowledge. It asks three unavoidable questions. What is real? How do we actually know it? And then, based on those two answers, how should we live our lives?
So reality, knowledge, and ethics.
Exactly. And the core argument presented here is that because every human being has to answer those three questions just to function in society, everyone is doing philosophy. The problem is just that, well, most people are doing it terribly.
Let's bring this down to earth with a great example from the lectures. Picture the guy next door. You probably know someone exactly like this.
Oh, I definitely do.
Right. He works a boring job, lives for the weekend, wants to have a few beers, watch the game. And he casually tells you his entire life motto is, you only go around once in life, so grab for all the gusto you can get.
It literally sounds like an old beer commercial.
It does. And most people would look at that guy and think he's the furthest thing from a philosopher. He's just an anti-intellectual guy trying to have a good time.
But the lecturer points out that this simple, seemingly shallow statement is actually a massive, sweeping, philosophical declaration.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the mechanics of what he's saying.
Right, you only go around once. That is a definitive cosmological claim about the nature of reality.
He's stating, as a matter of unquestionable fact, that there is no afterlife.
Exactly. He has ruled out reincarnation. He has ruled out a spiritual realm, any form of final divine judgment. He's constructed a completely materialist view of the universe.
He just answered the what is real question without even realizing it.
Yeah. And then he says, grab for all the gusto you can get. Well, he just answered the how should we live question right there.
He's made a profound ethical claim. The ultimate pursuit of human existence, the highest good, is maximizing personal pleasure in the present moment.
He has a highly structured worldview running the software of his brain, but it is completely unarticulated and, more importantly, it's totally unexamined.
Right. He hasn't asked himself why he believes those things or if those two statements even logically support each other.
Which brings us back to your car analogy.
Yeah, so is this state of blissful, unexamined ignorance actually dangerous to the guy next door? Like, if his philosophy is just drink beer and watch football, who cares if he doesn't know the underlying mechanics?
According to the framework we're exploring, it's profoundly dangerous, both on an individual and a societal level. Individually, living with unexamined assumptions leads to devastating internal inconsistencies.
How so?
Well, if your neighbor truly believes he only goes around once and should grab all the gusto, what happens when grabbing that gusto requires betraying a friend or stealing money?
Oh, I see. Does he have an unexamined moral boundary that suddenly contradicts his stated philosophy?
Exactly. These internal contradictions eventually tear a person apart when tragedy or, complex moral dilemmas strike.
Because the philosophy isn't strong enough to bear the weight of real human suffering.
Precisely. And on a societal level, the danger multiplies exponentially. When millions of people are driving these philosophical cars at high speeds, operating on wildly unexamined and deeply conflicting assumptions about what reality is, you don't just get disagreements.
You get chaos.
Total chaos. You get citizens who literally cannot communicate with each other because they are playing totally different games with different rules.
And you get legal systems and political structures built on faulty, collapsing foundations.
Right, so if we need to pull over and examine the mechanics, where do we begin?
How does human thought evolve from a guy just wanting a beer into the complex structures of human knowledge? The lecture series traces this back to something beautifully simple.
Human curiosity.
Yes. The material references Genesis 1.26, pointing out that humans were created with a mandate to have dominion over the earth, to subdue and organize it.
And the psychological engine driving that mandate is an inherent God-given curiosity. We are hardwired to want to know why things happen.
We want to understand our environment so we can survive it and eventually thrive in it. But, just wondering why the sky is blue isn't enough to build a civilization.
Because raw curiosity is chaotic. The lecture explains that when human curiosity is disciplined, highly structured, and organized, it becomes what we call science.
Let's define how the material uses that word, actually, because science gets thrown around a lot these days.
In this context, science is defined as a systematic approach to a clearly delineated, highly specific aspect of human experience.
With the ultimate goal of discovering general, predictable laws.
Yes. The lecture uses the example of predicting malaria. If you want to cure malaria, you don't study the entire universe at once. You don't study astronomy or literature.
You delineate.
Yeah.
You carve out a tiny, specific slice of biology, and you systematically observe the behavior of mosquitoes and parasites.
You observe that specific slice over and over until you find a regularity, a law.
And once you find the law that this specific parasite causes this specific fever, you have gained power over your environment. You can predict a disease and prevent it.
Science is incredibly powerful because of this narrow, disciplined focus, but, and this is a massive but in the lecture series, because science is so narrowly focused on specific physical mechanisms, it is fundamentally incapable of answering larger foundational questions.
Philosophy has to step into the room to ask the questions that a microscope cannot see.
Right. Think about the biologist studying malaria. She is relying on her human memory to record the data. She is relying on the assumption that her physical eyes are accurately reporting reality to her brain.
But what happens if you ask the biologist, is human memory actually a reliable mechanism for discovering truth?
Or, is the universe structured in a way that the human mind is even capable of comprehending it? The biologist can't put human memory in a test tube.
You can't run a chemical assay on the limits of human comprehension.
Exactly. The moment you ask those foundational questions, you have completely left the realm of science and entered the realm of philosophy.
To help you visualize this relationship, the lecturer introduces a brilliant architectural metaphor. It's the house of knowledge.
Picture a massive, sprawling building. The pillars holding up the structure of this building are the individual sciences.
So you have a sturdy pillar for biology, a pillar for geography, a pillar for psychology, a pillar for political science.
Right. They are all distinct delineated columns standing tall. But a collection of isolated pillars standing in a field does not make a house.
Philosophy serves two absolutely vital architectural roles to turn those pillars into a functional building.
The first is what the lecturer calls the critical task. This is the foundation beneath the pillars. The critical task of philosophy is to dig underground and ruthlessly examine the hidden presuppositions that all those scientific pillars are resting on.
Because every science rests on unprovable assumptions.
Exactly. If a chemist assumes that the natural world operates on uniform laws like water will boil at the same temperature tomorrow as it did today, the philosopher is the one who taps on that foundation and asks, why do you assume nature is uniform?
Have you traveled into the future to observe tomorrow? No. Then you are operating on a philosophical assumption.
Philosophy secures the foundation by analyzing those hidden beliefs, and the material highlights Socrates as the ultimate master of this critical task.
Oh, Socrates was famous in ancient Athens for being a total nuisance to powerful people.
He really was. He would walk up to a prominent politician or a wealthy merchant and simply ask, what is justice?
Yeah, and the politician would confidently rattle off a definition, assuming his pillar of knowledge was solid, but Socrates would just start digging at the foundation.
He'd say, if justice is simply returning what you owe, what if you borrow a weapon from a friend and then your friend goes completely insane? Is it justice to return a deadly weapon to a madman?
And suddenly the politician realizes his definition of justice is totally flawed.
Socrates would keep asking these questions, peeling back the layers, until the person realized they actually had no idea what justice was. They had built a massive intellectual structure on top of a foundation they had never bothered to inspect.
Okay, so if the critical task of philosophy is inspecting the foundation, what's the second vital role?
The second role is the constructive task. Philosophy provides the roof of the house of knowledge. The roof is what actually turns the pillars into a cohesive home.
It brings all those separate, isolated pillars of science together into one unified, coherent structure.
Yes, and the philosophical term for this roof is a worldview. The material defines a worldview as a network of unproven presuppositions that interrelates all human experience into one cohesive picture.
Notice that it says unproven. These aren't empirical facts you can verify in a lab.
Right. They are the overarching fundamental beliefs through which you interpret every single fact you encounter. And without that roof, without a unifying worldview, the pillars start to violently contradict each other.
The lecturer gives an incredible real-world anecdote of a typical university student to illustrate this cognitive disaster.
This is a perfect example of what happens when the education system provides the pillars but refuses to build a roof.
Imagine a student walks into a psychology class on a Tuesday morning.
Right.
The professor is a strict behaviorist.
Right.
He teaches the student that human beings are essentially nothing more than highly advanced white rats. We do not possess free will. Every single action we take, every thought we have, is just a predetermined biological response to environmental conditioning.
We are just meat machines reacting to stimuli. It is a totally deterministic, mechanistic view of human nature.
Student takes notes, passes the quiz, eats lunch, and then walks into an afternoon political science class.
And this is where it gets messy.
In this room, the professor is passionately lecturing about human rights. He argues that the current government is an oppressive regime, and it is the students' moral duty to exercise their free will, rise up, and become a revolutionary to overturn the tyrannical system.
The contradiction here is absolute. It is staggering.
It's cognitive dissonance on an epic scale. At 10 a.m., you are a programmed biological rat with literally zero capacity for choice. At 2 p.m., you are a completely free moral agent responsible for overthrowing an empire.
The university is handing the student completely contradictory foundational views of what it even means to be human in the exact same building on the exact same day.
And here's the tragedy. Because neither professor explicitly states their philosophical presuppositions, the student rarely notices the contradiction.
They are just handed isolated bricks and expected to build a life. But how can you build a cohesive worldview when your psychology brick completely invalidates your political science brick?
You really can't. This is why philosophy is inescapable. Without the critical task of examining the foundations and the constructive task of building a worldview roof, you just live with what the material calls dialectical tension.
You harbor massive internal contradictions that eventually fracture your mind, leaving you susceptible to whatever loud ideology happens to be trending that day.
So to prevent that collapse, the lecture outlines the specific tools you need to build a stable roof. Philosophy is divided into 4 standard departments.
Think of these as the 4 distinct tool belts that philosophers wear. Every debate we are going to explore today hinges on these 4 categories.
Let's lay out the tool belts: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and logic. I want to dive deep into each one, starting with metaphysics.
Metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality. It asks about the origin, the nature, and the fundamental structure of everything that exists.
The lecture makes a funny observation that if you go to a local bookstore and try to find the metaphysics section, you usually end up staring at shelves full of bizarre, occult literature, crystal healing guides, and Twilight Zone phenomena.
It sounds dismissive, but linguistically it makes sense. Meta means beyond, and physics means the physical world.
Oh, yeah.
So asking if spiritual beings exist, or asking what the ultimate invisible substance of the universe is, technically falls under metaphysics. The core metaphysical debate is usually whether reality is purely made of physical matter, or if there is an immaterial spiritual dimension.
Let's move to the second tool belt, epistemology. This word sounds incredibly intimidating, like something you only say to sound smart at a dinner party, but it is deeply practical.
Epistemology is the study of knowledge itself. It explores the nature of human knowing, and more importantly, the absolute limits of what we can know. How do you justify your claim that you know something?
The lecture series provides a very rigid formula for this. It states that true knowledge requires 3 specific ingredients: belief, truth, and a good reason. If you're missing even one of those, you don't actually possess knowledge.
Let's break that down. You cannot know something that is objectively false. You also cannot know something if you don't actually believe it yourself.
That makes sense.
But the trickiest part is the third ingredient, a good reason. Because if you believe something that happens to be true, but you have a terrible, illogical reason for believing it, philosophers argue you don't actually possess knowledge, you just made a lucky guess.
Okay, I have an analogy for this. Let's see if it holds up to the formula.
Let's hear it.
Say I have a pair of lucky neon green socks. I believe with all my heart that if I wear them, I will ace my final exam. I wear the socks, I take the test, I get an A+.
Okay.
In my mind, I have belief in the socks. I have the truth of the A+. And to me, the socks are a good reason. So I claim I have knowledge that my socks are magic. Tell me why an epistemologist would rip this apart.
Well, an epistemologist would dismantle your analogy by attacking your justification. Your belief and the true outcome have zero causal link.
Right.
Epistemology demands that the good reason, actually, logically connects to the truth. Your belief in the neon green socks did not cause the professor to grade your paper favorably.
My studying caused it, probably.
Exactly. Or perhaps you just randomly guessed the right multiple choice answers. The philosopher's job is to ruthlessly cross-examine what constitutes a genuinely good reason.
Is eyewitness testimony a good reason to execute a man?
Right. Or is human memory a good reason to trust your childhood narrative? Epistemology is basically the courtroom of the mind.
Which perfectly sets up the third department, ethics. Once you know what is real, and you know how you know it, ethics is the study of right and wrong actions and attitudes.
We all operate ethically every day. You decide not to steal your coworker's lunch.
Usually.
Right, hopefully. But philosophers dig into meta-ethics. What do the concepts of right and wrong even mean?
Are the universal laws written into the fabric of the cosmos, or are they just social agreements we invented to keep from killing each other?
The material mentions utilitarianism as a classic ethical theory. It argues that an action is morally right if it produces the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people.
That sounds very democratic.
It does, but a philosopher performing the critical task would immediately push back. Why is human happiness the ultimate standard of right and wrong? Who decided that pleasure is the ultimate good?
What if the greatest happiness for the majority requires the horrific enslavement of a minority?
Exactly. Ethics forces you to justify your moral yardstick.
And finally, the fourth department is logic. Logic is the mathematics of language. It is the study of the principles used to distinguish correct, valid reasoning from incorrect, invalid reasoning.
If you build a flawless metaphysical theory but your logic is faulty, the whole roof collapses.
The lecturer provides some excellent examples of logical fallacies that people use every single day. For instance, the appeal to force. The material jokes about a professor saying, "Take my course or I'll punch you in the nose."
The threat of physical violence might coerce you into taking the course, but it does absolutely nothing to make the logical premise that you should take the course because it's valuable actually true.
Or the appeal to popularity, which dominates our modern elections and social media. Vote for this wild and crazy guy because everyone else is voting for him.
That is the fallacy of assuming that truth is determined by majority opinion.
And history is littered with examples where the vast majority of the population was completely disastrously wrong about science. about human rights, about geography.
Popularity has zero bearing on truth. The source also breaks down a more structural logical trap, which is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. It deals with if P, then Q statements.
This one traps people constantly.
It really does. The faulty structure goes like this. If premise P is true, then outcome Q is true. We can observe that outcome Q is true, therefore premise P must be the cause.
To explain why this is a trap, the lecturer uses a literature example. Premise 1. If William Shakespeare wrote the epic poem Paradise Lost, then he is a great author.
That is a logically sound statement. If he had written it, it would prove his greatness.
Premise 2. William Shakespeare is a great author. That is an observable, historically accepted truth.
Conclusion. Therefore, William Shakespeare wrote Paradise Lost.
Which is factually false. John Milton wrote Paradise Lost.
The logic failed because affirming the second part of an if-then statement, affirming that Shakespeare is great, doesn't prove the first part caused it.
Right. Shakespeare is great because he wrote Hamlet and Macbeth, not Paradise Lost.
Just because the outcome is true doesn't mean your assumed cause is the right one.
Once you understand these 4 tools, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and logic, and you start using them to look at history, you immediately hit a massive centuries-old fork in the road.
The lecturer calls this the Great Divide. It is a fundamental disagreement about the very nature of reality that has split thinkers since the dawn of civilization.
It's the battle between monism and atomism. Let's clearly define the battle lines. What exactly is a monist?
Monism is the metaphysical tendency to view all of reality as fundamentally one. It emphasizes continuity, stability, and enduring characteristics.
Okay, so if you are a monist, you look out at the universe and you don't see a trillion different objects.
No, you see a single, interconnected, continuous whole. You believe that the differences between a tree, a rock, and a human being are just temporary illusions or matters of degree, not fundamental separations. All is one.
And what is the opposing view? Atomism.
Atomism views reality as discrete, broken down into separate, encapsulated bits and pieces. It emphasizes constant change, motion, and the dynamic, fragmented nature of existence.
So an atomist looks at the world and sees ultimate separateness.
You are you, I am me, the tree is the tree, and we are fundamentally disconnected entities bumping into each other.
So monism focuses on the cohesive whole, and atomism focuses on the fragmented parts. But what is truly fascinating about this lecture series is how it connects these metaphysical views of reality to how these philosophers define truth itself.
Yes, your metaphysics dictates your epistemology. Because monists believe reality is one connected web, they naturally adopt what is called the coherence theory of truth.
How does the coherence theory work?
It argues that a single statement cannot be judged as true in isolation. A statement is only considered true if it perfectly coheres or logically aligns with an overall, massive, unified web of theory.
Truth isn't found in a single isolated fact.
Right. Truth is the entire system fitting together without contradiction.
Because reality is a connected web, truth must be a connected web.
Exactly. Conversely, atomism pairs with the correspondence theory of truth.
Which argues what?
The correspondence theory says a statement is true if the specific idea in your independent mind accurately corresponds to a specific independent discrete object out in the real physical world.
So if you look at a chair and your mind registers a chair, the statement, "there is a chair," corresponds to reality.
It's a one-to-one match of isolated facts. To bring this abstract debate into focus, the lecturer contrasts 2 historical heavyweights, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and David Hume.
Hegel was a towering figure of monism.
He was. He viewed reality organically. He despised mechanical metaphors. He preferred biological ones.
The material explains that Hegel viewed reality like a budding tree or a tadpole turning into a frog. Things are constantly, fluidly evolving into each other.
Therefore, Hegel believed that any absolute statement you try to make about truth is ultimately just an approximation. Because reality is always flowing and changing shape, you cannot pin it down with a single discrete sentence.
If you point at a tadpole in a pond and say, "that is definitively a tadpole," wait a few weeks and it's a frog.
Wait a few years and it's dead matter. Your truth was just a temporary snapshot of a continuous, eternal process.
Now contrast that fluid organic view with David Hume, who leaned heavily into atomism. Hume viewed reality mechanically.
The classic philosophical analogy for Hume is a table of billiard balls.
Clack, clack, clack. One distinct ball hits another distinct ball.
Distinct, separate, discrete events causing other discrete events. For Hume, truths are completely isolated.
You can absolutely know a discrete fact about a discrete object at a highly specific moment in time, entirely independent of the rest of the universe.
So, if a Hegelian monist and a Humean atomist sit down at a table to have a debate, they aren't just arguing about the facts.
They're arguing about the very definition of what a fact is.
They are trying to play two entirely different sports on the exact same field, and they are both furious that the other person doesn't understand the rules.
I want to build on the digital photograph analogy I was thinking about earlier to really explain this disconnect.
Go for it.
Imagine you put a massive digital photograph of a beautiful mountain landscape on a screen. The monists are standing 10 feet back. They're looking at the entire cohesive image. They see the mountain, the sky, the river. It's beautiful. It flows together. It's a unified picture. But the atomists walk right up to the screen, pressing their noses against the glass, zooming in until all they can see are millions of disconnected, individual glowing red, green, and blue pixels.
That is exactly the dynamic.
How can they possibly debate each other? The atomist is screaming, reality is just a red square next to a blue square.
And the monolith is screaming, you are violently oversimplifying reality. You're chopping a mountain into meaningless boxes.
And the atomist yells back, you are ignoring the concrete data. You're living in a vague mystical fog where nothing can be empirically proven.
As the material points out, this inability to agree on the basic foundational rules leads directly into endless historical paradoxes, what the lecturer calls dialectical tensions.
Let's explore that term. What exactly is a dialectical tension?
A dialectical tension is a massive internal contradiction within a philosophy that the philosopher simply cannot escape.
The lecturer argues that unbelieving philosophies, those not grounded in the Christian framework, constantly fall into these traps.
When they hit a wall they can't explain, they either become highly arbitrary, just inventing rules out of thin air to make their theory work, or they become completely self-contradictory.
We see this clearly when the material looks at the ultimate ancient philosophical rivalry, Plato versus his own student, Aristotle.
Plato was deeply obsessed with epistemology. He knew that for true, reliable knowledge to exist, there had to be something stable and unchanging out there to know.
If reality is just Heraclitus's river, constantly flowing, changing, and eroding, you can never truly know anything because by the time you name it, it has changed.
But Plato looked at the physical world and saw that everything was particular and constantly changing. Everything degrades.
The lecturer uses the example of ducks. Plato can look at a pond and see Huey, Dewey, and Louie. He sees particular, individual, flawed ducks.
But he cannot physically find duckness, the perfect, universal, unchanging formula or essence of what makes a duck a duck.
Because you can't put duckness under a microscope. It's a concept.
But without that concept, language fails. How can you call them all ducks if they don't share a universal essence? So to solve this epistemological crisis, Plato made a massive, highly arbitrary leap.
He invented a new dimension.
He really did. He posited the existence of an entirely separate, invisible realm of reality, the realm of forms or ideas.
He claimed that true reality, perfect duckness, and perfect human nature existed eternally in this otherworldly realm.
And our physical world is just a flawed, temporary shadow of it.
Wait, so to explain how we know what a duck is, he just arbitrarily invented a magical dimension of perfect concepts.
Yes. From the lecturer's critical perspective, it is a completely arbitrary solution to a dialectical tension. Aristotle, who studied under Plato, saw this flaw immediately.
He realized you can't just invent a second universe to explain this one.
Aristotle brought philosophy back down to earth. He argued that the form, the universal essence of a thing, isn't floating in some mystical dimension.
It is embedded directly within the physical object itself.
The universal form of the massive oak tree is already entirely contained within the tiny physical acorn. Aristotle wanted to scientifically explain particularities in motion. How does the acorn become the oak?
But the lecturer points out that Aristotle fell right into his own dialectical trap trying to explain that motion.
To explain why the acorn changes into an oak, Aristotle just arbitrarily assumed that every single object in the universe has a built-in principle of motion, an internal drive pushing it from potentiality to actuality.
He essentially argued, things change because it is simply in their nature to change, which logically is begging the question.
He took for granted the very mechanism he was supposed to be explaining. He arbitrarily assumed a hidden drive without providing any foundational source for it.
So both ancient geniuses hit a wall they couldn't climb over. But this isn't just an ancient Greek problem.
Not at all.
The lecture series provides modern examples of this exact same dialectical tension, pulling society completely apart. We see it vividly in modern epistemology and the tension between rationalism and irrationalism.
Rationalism is the incredibly optimistic belief that the human mind is supreme. It believes that everything in reality is ultimately knowable, quantifiable, and rationally describable by human logic.
But the dialectical tension is glaringly obvious. If everything in the cosmos is knowable, whose mind is actually big enough to know it?
Right. No single human mind, nor all human minds combined, possesses infinite capacity. So the rationalist eventually hits a wall of incomprehension.
And when human reason fails to explain a tragedy or a quantum anomaly, the pendulum swings violently to the exact opposite extreme: irrationalism.
They throw their hands up in despair and say, well, if reason can't explain this, the human mind must be totally limited. We can't actually know anything for sure. Truth is an illusion.
Society bounces violently back and forth between arrogant utopian confidence that human science can conquer the universe and despairing, cynical skepticism that we are just biological accidents guessing in the dark.
And we see this exact same dialectical whiplash in politics, too.
This section of the material blew my mind, because you literally see it playing out on the evening news right now. It is the political tension between the manyness of individual freedom and the oneness of state control.
It is a devastating, inescapable cycle in secular political theory.
If a political philosophy decides to maximize atomistic manyness, pushing for total, unfettered, radical individual freedom above all else, society inevitably degrades into anarchy.
If everyone is their own absolute moral authority, doing whatever is right in their own eyes, you lose the social contract.
You get total chaos, people hurting each other to maximize their own freedom.
And human society cannot survive chaos. We are desperate for order. So what happens historically?
The pendulum swings violently away from freedom. To cure the terrifying anarchy, society demands monistic oneness.
They demand order. They willingly elect a strongman or empower a massive authoritarian state to impose law and security from the top down.
Which, as history proves, inevitably leads to tyranny. The state becomes so powerful that it starts crushing the individual to maintain its perfect, unified order.
And when the tyranny becomes unbearable and suffocating, the individuals rebel. They stage a revolution in the name of freedom, which shatters the state and plunges society right back into the exact anarchy they started with.
It is a political nightmare loop.
It really is.
So how does this lecture series, operating from a Christian worldview, attempt to resolve these massive, historically inescapable paradoxes?
The material asserts that the Christian framework resolves this tension specifically through its foundational conception of ultimate reality. The Creator God, who is inherently Trinitarian in nature.
I mean, God is 3 in 1.
Yes. In the Orthodox Christian conception, God is one single unified essence, but existing in 3 distinct equal persons. Therefore, the very foundation of reality, unity, which is oneness or order, and diversity, which is manyness or individuality, are equally ultimate.
They exist in perfect harmony in the Creator.
Because of that, the Christian doesn't have to choose a side in the Great Divide.
They don't have to choose a monistic universe where individuality is swallowed up in a giant blob, or an atomistic universe where unity and connection are impossible.
Exactly. Because the Creator possesses both attributes perfectly, the world he created can meaningfully contain both universal order and distinct individual freedom without them destroying each other. It bridges the metaphysical gap.
The lecturer also applies this to epistemology.
Right. The material argues that a Christian relies on God's divine revelation. This allows a person to engage in profound, confident, rational thought because they believe God is a rational creator who made a uniform, orderly universe.
While simultaneously admitting the irrational limits of the finite human mind.
A human doesn't have to possess infinite knowledge because they trust the God who does.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here. Does relying on God as the ultimate precondition act as a sort of intellectual get-out-of-jail-free card for philosophers when they hit a dead end?
What do you mean?
Like, is it like a student failing a math test and just writing "God did it" in the margins? Or is the lecturer arguing that this is genuinely the only functional bridge over these paradoxes?
That is a very common critique, usually referred to as the God of the gaps fallacy, using God to fill in the temporary holes of human scientific ignorance.
Right.
But the lecturer's proposition, drawn from a school of thought called Presuppositional Apologetics, is entirely different.
Can you define presuppositional apologetics for us?
Yes. Presuppositional apologetics doesn't try to prove God exists by looking at a tree and saying, look how complex it is, someone must have made it.
Okay, so how does it work?
Instead, it argues that you cannot logically justify the existence of anything, not the laws of logic, not the uniformity of nature required for science, not universal ethical standards, unless you first presuppose the Christian God as the foundation.
Ah, so the lecturer isn't saying God is a band-aid for our ignorance.
He is arguing that God is the concrete slab the entire house of knowledge is built upon. He asserts that without that specific foundation, human philosophy inevitably collapses into the destructive dialectical tensions we just explored.
And if you are listening to this thinking, well, these abstract paradoxes about ultimate foundations don't affect my daily life, let's look at how the ancient Greeks turned these heady theories into actual lifestyle brands.
Brands that look incredibly, almost uncomfortably familiar today.
The biblical book of Ecclesiastes famously states there is nothing new under the sun. And this section of the material proves it by outlining 7 different Greek approaches to life and ethics.
It is uncanny how you can map modern personality types onto these ancient schools.
Let's run through the Greek smorgasbord. First up, the Sophists.
The Sophists were essentially ancient relativists. They believed that absolute truth is either entirely subjective or completely unknowable.
Therefore, the goal of human communication isn't to discover what is true. It is simply to manipulate language, win arguments, and acquire power.
The lecturer accurately compares them to modern, highly paid, hired gun lawyers. I don't care if my client is guilty or innocent. Truth doesn't matter. I only care about persuading the jury and winning the case.
The exhaustion of that cynical, power-hungry society eventually led to the second group, the Cynics.
The Cynics looked at the corrupt political games of the Sophists and decided that civilization itself was a disease. To find genuine happiness and purity, you had to completely defy the establishment, reject all social norms, abandon your possessions, and get back to raw, untamed nature.
The material literally compares the Cynics to the 1960s hippie counterculture movement. Drop out, tune in, stick it to the man, go live in a commune.
But living in the dirt gets exhausting, which paved the way for the third group, the Stoics.
The Stoics preached radical emotional detachment.
They believed you must cultivate an absolute indifference to both pleasure and pain. You must exercise supreme self-control, let cold reason conquer hot passion.
Maintain a stiff upper lip during tragedy, and just accept your fate by going with the flow of nature.
Fourth, you have the hedonists. They went the opposite direction. They lived entirely for pleasure, but they split into 2 distinct, competing factions based on how they define pleasure.
First, you had the Cyrenaics. They believed in maximizing the sheer raw quantity of physical pleasure. They were the ultimate ancient party animals.
Their philosophy was basically, he who dies with the most toys or the most physical experiences wins.
And then you had the Epicureans. They also lived strictly for pleasure, but they focused on gentle, refined quality rather than chaotic quantity.
They realized that partying like a Cyrenaic every night just leads to massive hangovers, disease, and pain, which defeats the pursuit of pleasure.
So their ideal life was quiet, intellectual conversation, avoiding politics, and sharing a little fine wine and cheese with a small group of good friends.
The fifth group was the skeptics. They looked at all these conflicting schools of thought and simply gave up.
They concluded that human beings are incapable of knowing anything for sure, so it is pointless to commit to any worldview.
And finally, the eclectics, the ultimate ancient consumers. The eclectics took the smorgasbord approach. They treated philosophy like a buffet.
They would grab a little fruit salad from every worldview.
Right, they'd take a little stoic resilience for the workplace, a little hedonistic pleasure for the weekend, without ever worrying if the underlying principles of those philosophies completely contradicted each other.
It is wild that human behavior hasn't changed a bit in over 2 millennia. But the lecture series doesn't just list these ancient lifestyle brands. It demonstrates how a Christian philosopher would utterly dismantle one of them from the inside out.
This section is a masterclass in internal critique. The lecturer calls this method answering a fool according to his folly, referencing a strategy from the book of Proverbs.
You don't defeat an opposing worldview by just throwing external Bible verses at it.
No, you temporarily step inside their worldview, assume their own rules, and show how the philosophy logically destroys itself.
And the target the lecturer chooses to dismantle is Epicurus, the gentle hedonist.
Let's break down this courtroom-style takedown.
Epicurus builds his entire worldview on 3 specific pillars. Pillar 1 is his epistemology. Epicurus boldly claims that all human knowledge is strictly perceptual. Seeing is believing.
If you cannot physically observe it, touch it, or measure it with your five senses, you cannot know it. It sounds incredibly modern. It sounds like the bedrock of empiricism.
But the lecturer asks a devastating, fatal question. How does Epicurus physically perceive that abstract rule?
Right. Has Epicurus ever seen the concept of all knowledge walking down the street? Has he tasted it? Has he put his rule in a beaker and weighed it?
No. His rule, all knowledge is perceptual, is an abstract, universal philosophical claim. It cannot be empirically observed.
Therefore, by his own strict rule of knowledge, he cannot possibly know that his rule of knowledge is true.
The philosophy decapitates itself on the very first step.
It is completely self-defeating. Let's look at Pillar 2, metaphysics. Epicurus claims that all of reality is made entirely of material atoms reacting blindly to natural laws.
There is no soul, there is no God, there is no spiritual realm, just atoms in the void.
Which means, logically, the human brain is nothing but a clump of material atoms reacting to the unchangeable laws of physics and chemistry.
And if the brain is just matter in motion, reacting like baking soda and vinegar, then human beings do not possess actual free will.
Your thoughts, your beliefs, your arguments aren't the result of rational deliberation. They are just inevitable chemical reactions that you have absolutely no control over.
And here's the kill shot from the lecturer. If your thoughts are just unavoidable chemical reactions, there is absolutely no reason to trust that your thoughts are objectively true.
The material argues that we have no more reason to trust the chemical output of our brain than we have to trust the way a weed grows in the garden.
A weed doesn't grow truthfully or falsely, it just grows according to biology.
By reducing the mind to mere atoms, Epicurus's materialism destroys the very foundation required to trust his own rational thought.
And finally, Pillar 3, ethics. Epicurus says the ultimate goal of life is to live for pleasure, and his only justification for this rule is the observation that every living creature naturally seeks pleasure and avoids pain.
But the internal critique points out a massive, unbridgeable, logical leap. Just because people do behave a certain way doesn't mathematically prove they should behave that way.
Mere observation of behavior doesn't create a universal moral imperative.
The is does not equal the ought. And furthermore, if we are just bags of meaningless material atoms, why did Epicurus argue that high-minded mental pleasures like friendship and philosophy are better than base physical pleasures like gluttony?
An atom is an atom. There is no higher or lower atom.
Looking closely at this takedown is sobering because modern secular humanism looks almost exactly like Epicureanism. We prioritize empirical science, materialist reality, and personal happiness as the highest good.
We just dress it up with smartphones, streaming services, and better medicine. It makes me wonder, are we as a society basically just running a broken playbook written in 300 BC simply because we forgot how to critically evaluate its foundations?
The material heavily implies that we are. We have adopted the conclusions of Epicurus without realizing that the foundational arguments supporting those conclusions were logically dismantled thousands of years ago.
We are living in a massive societal house with a completely collapsed foundation, collectively pretending the floor isn't caving in.
Well, you would logically think that eventually humanity would figure this out. The ancients struggled and hit dead ends, sure, but surely the great modern post-Enlightenment thinkers, the geniuses of the scientific revolution, solved the puzzle of human knowledge, right?
Actually, as the lecture series details in its historical survey, the modern thinkers didn't solve the puzzle. They essentially broke the puzzle pieces entirely, realized they couldn't put them together, and threw them off the table.
This brings us to the modern crisis of knowledge. Starting around the 17th century, modern philosophy desperately embarked on a quest to find an absolute, unshakable foundation for human knowledge without relying on God, the church, or divine revelation.
They wanted an autonomous foundation, built by man alone, and they immediately split into two warring camps, rationalism and empiricism.
We discussed these briefly earlier, but let's dive into exactly how they collapsed. Rationalism believed that true knowledge is justified solely by mental reflection, completely apart from physical experience.
You don't need to measure the world. You just need to sit in a quiet room, close your eyes, and think flawlessly.
The undisputed poster child for rationalism is René Descartes. He famously decided to strip away every single thing he could possibly doubt.
He doubted his senses, he doubted his memories, he even imagined a scenario where an evil demon was tricking his mind.
He doubted until he arrived at his bedrock, undeniable truth. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum.
It sounds incredibly profound and mathematically unshakable. But the lecturer points out that later philosophers, specifically Bertrand Russell, completely dismantled Descartes' foundational bedrock.
Russell noted that Descartes made a massive arbitrary assumption in his very first premise. By stating, "I doubt," Descartes was already secretly presupposing the existence of a unified, independent, continuous self, and I doing the doubting.
He smuggled his conclusion directly into his premise. Russell argued he should have just said, "There is doubting occurring."
Which doesn't prove an individual continuous I exists at all, it just proves a thought happened.
Furthermore, the lecturer demonstrates how rationalism proved to be wildly, almost laughably arbitrary in its conclusions.
If pure, unadulterated reason is so reliable, it should naturally lead brilliant men to a shared consensus about reality, right?
But the material highlights three brilliant rationalists who used the exact same method of pure reason to reach totally contradictory conclusions. Let's look at the results.
Descartes used pure reason to conclude that reality is dualistic. He decided the universe is made of two distinct substances, the immaterial mind and the physical body.
Then you have Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza used pure mathematical reason and deduced that reality must be monistic.
He argued that God is infinite, and if any other substance existed besides God, God wouldn't be infinite. Therefore, there is only one single substance in the universe, and we are all just modes of it. God and nature are the exact same thing.
And then you have Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz used pure reason to conclude that reality is incredibly fractured. He argued the universe is made up of millions of microscopic, distinct entities he called windowless monads.
A concept that requires explanation. Leibniz argued these monads were simple, indivisible substances that make up reality.
They are windowless, meaning they cannot physically interact with or affect each other at all.
But God pre-programmed a pre-established harmony into them, like millions of clocks perfectly synchronized, so it merely looks like they are interacting.
It sounds like the plot of a sci-fi movie. You have dualism, monism, and windowless monads, all generated by the exact same infallible method of pure reason. It was an absolute disaster.
Pure reason didn't lead to universal truth. It led to pure, arbitrary, unverifiable speculation.
So if the rationalist camp failed to build a foundation, what about the other side? Empiricism.
Empiricism, championed by thinkers like John Locke and David Hume, took the opposite approach. They claimed there are absolutely no innate ideas.
The human mind is born as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and all knowledge, every single thing we know, comes strictly from sensory experience and physical observation.
Yeah, but David Hume, possessing a razor-sharp and ruthless logical mind, took this empirical premise to its absolute terrifying conclusion: total skepticism.
Hume was relentless. He argued that if you strictly adhere to the rule that you only know what you can physically observe with your senses, you cannot actually logically prove the most basic foundational facts required for human existence.
The material illustrates this with the problem of personal identity. Imagine looking at a photograph of yourself as an infant. You confidently claim, "I know that baby is me."
But Hume taps you on the shoulder and asks, how do you know you are the exact same continuous person?
Have you been consciously, unbrokenly observing your own core identity for the last 30 years without blinking or sleeping?
The answer is no. You haven't observed it. You just assume a continuous identity because you have some fragmented memories.
Hume also aimed his skepticism directly at the heart of science, the principle of cause and effect. You believe that dropping a glass causes it to shatter. You believe the sun will rise tomorrow. Why? Because you observed it happen yesterday.
But Hume points out a devastating flaw. You have never observed the future. You have never, ever observed a universal law dictating that nature must remain uniform.
The lecturer talks about a doctor prescribing medicine. The doctor says, take this pill, it cured people with your disease in the past.
But strictly speaking, under empiricism, the doctor hasn't observed the future to prove that the chemical properties of that pill won't spontaneously change tomorrow.
Empiricism, by demanding strict physical observation for all knowledge, inadvertently destroyed the foundation for human identity, the existence of a physical world outside our minds, and all of scientific prediction.
It led to an absolute paralyzing black hole of skepticism.
So both autonomous camps totally failed. Rationalism floated off into arbitrary fantasy, and empiricism sank into a skeptical abyss.
And into this massive intellectual crisis stepped a man who triggered what can only be described as a philosophical earthquake: Immanuel Kant.
Kant published the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, and it is not an exaggeration to say the intellectual world has never recovered. Kant saw Hume's skepticism destroying the very possibility of science, and Kant wanted to save it.
But the way he saved science was incredibly drastic. Kant essentially argued that the empiricists were entirely wrong about how the brain works.
The human mind is not a passive blank slate just receiving raw data from the outside world like a camera.
Instead, Kant proposed what he called his Copernican revolution. He argued that the human mind actively imposes its own internal, pre-programmed categories onto the raw, chaotic sensory data it receives.
Categories like time, space, and causation.
This is the crux of Kant's theory. When you see a baseball fly through the air, hit a window, and the window shatters, you deeply believe you are objectively observing cause and effect happening out there in the real world.
Kant said, no, you aren't. Cause and effect isn't actually a property of the external world. Your mind's internal software violently forces you to interpret the visual data as cause and effect because that is the only way a human brain is capable of processing information.
Wait, so Kant is essentially saying that science isn't studying the actual external world. Science is just studying the inside of our own minds.
Yes. He's saying we're all born wearing permanent, unremovable virtual reality goggles. We can only ever see the VR software's interpretation of the room.
We can measure the digital walls, we can study the digital physics, but we can never ever take the goggles off to see what the actual objective room looks like in reality.
So, to use his terminology, we only know the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us through our mental VR filters. But we can never know the noumenal world objective reality, the thing in itself.
From the perspective of this lecture series, does Kant's VR theory completely destroy the concept of objective truth?
From the lecture's perspective, it deals a fatal blow to autonomous philosophy. Because if you concede that humans can never, by definition, access reality as it actually is, then any claim about ultimate truth claims about God, about the human soul, about objective morality, is permanently cordoned off in the unknowable noumenal realm.
Kant saved the mechanical functions of science, but he paid for it by sacrificing human access to objective reality. God became ultimately unknowable by human reason.
And by permanently severing humanity from objective reality, Kant inadvertently launched the despair, the profound anxiety, and the intellectual surrender of the 20th century.
Which brings us to the final era, the source material covers, the 20th century anti-philosophies.
The series notes that in the wake of Kant's earthquake, modern philosophy largely just gave up. They threw in the towel on the historical 2,000-year pursuit of building a unified, comprehensive worldview roof.
The Christian thinker Francis Schaeffer termed the resulting modern movements anti-philosophies.
They are labeled anti-philosophies because they abdicate the traditional foundational role of philosophy. They no longer even attempt to answer the big questions about reality, knowledge, and ethics as a single cohesive system.
The lecturer outlines three major modern movements that essentially raise the white flag. First, pragmatism.
Pragmatism, heavily popularized in America by thinkers like William James and John Dewey, essentially says, look, we can't figure out absolute truth. It's unknowable, so who cares?
Let's stop arguing about metaphysics. Truth is simply whatever practically works to solve our immediate human problems.
Well, it is entirely focused on utility. But the critique presented in the material is glaring. Pragmatism can tell you the most efficient way to solve a problem, but it has absolutely no moral mechanism to tell you which problems you should be solving in the first place.
You can be highly pragmatic and efficient in building a life-saving hospital, or you can be highly pragmatic and efficient in building a concentration camp. Pragmatism offers no moral compass, just a stopwatch.
Exactly. The second movement is linguistic analysis, heavily influenced by early thinkers like Wittgenstein.
Yeah. This one feels almost like an academic cop-out. These philosophers looked at centuries of bloody debate over God, human freedom, and the meaning of life, and concluded, you know what? These aren't actually deep metaphysical problems.
They're just language mix-ups. We are just using vocabulary imprecisely.
They reduced the grand, sweeping pursuit of wisdom to a highly technical debate over grammar and syntax. They argued that if we just clarified our definitions and stopped using words like soul or essence, the big existential questions would evaporate.
Which, again, provides a human being with absolutely no actual worldview to live by when they face a real crisis.
And finally, the movement that defines modern angst more than any other, existentialism. Think Jean-Paul Sartre sitting in a Parisian cafe.
Existentialism starts from the bleak premise that the universe is absurd, completely irrational, and entirely devoid of inherent meaning. The famous summarizing phrase is, existence precedes essence.
Meaning you are just born. You exist. You are an absurd, unplanned biological accident dropped into a cold, meaningless void.
You have no predefined essence. You have no human nature designed by a creator. You have no ultimate purpose written in the stars.
Therefore, your only job, the only tiny sliver of truth available to you, is to exercise your radical freedom and authentically choose your own rules, create your own meaning, and invent your own essence from scratch.
You have to build a house in the dark with no blueprint. It is a philosophy of profound, terrifying isolation and psychological burden. It frames freedom not as a gift, but as an unbearable weight.
So the autonomous worldly philosophers hit a dead end, gave up the ship, and fractured society into utility, grammar debates, and existential despair.
In stark contrast to this collapse, the lecture series highlights the Christian synthesis, specifically pointing to the monumental work of the 20th century Christian philosopher Cornelius Van Til.
Van Til's work is presented in the material as the ultimate, rigorous counterargument to the Kantian collapse.
Remember, Kant tried to find the preconditions of human experience autonomously, starting just with the isolated human mind, and he ended up trapped in a VR prison of skepticism cut off from reality.
But Van Til, utilizing presuppositional apologetics, argued that the triune God of the Bible is the exact, logically necessary precondition required to have any meaningful human experience at all.
Van Til argued that you simply cannot logically justify the existence of uniform scientific laws, absolute ethical standards, the immaterial laws of logic, or inherent human dignity without beginning with the foundational presupposition of the Christian creator.
God is the only foundation dense enough to actually support the weight of the human house of knowledge.
The series concludes that without that specific foundation, you inevitably end up with the exact foolishness of the world that the Apostle Paul described in 1 Corinthians 1. The wisdom of the world, when left to its own devices, structurally destroys itself.
According to this framework, the autonomous pursuit of wisdom ends in the cynical declaration that wisdom itself is impossible.
Which is pretty bleak.
It is. Which makes me want to ask a culminating question about human nature. If modern philosophy has, as the material suggests, given up the ship, isn't there actually a dark, seductive comfort in that for a lot of people?
Comfort.
Yeah, isn't it freeing in a somewhat twisted way to just exist without having to answer to a grand, overarching theory of everything? Doesn't existentialism, for all its angst, let you off the moral hook?
It absolutely offers the illusion of being off the hook. But the reality of living in an unexamined house with no roof is that when a massive storm hits, when you face profound, unjust suffering, a complex moral dilemma regarding your children, or the terrifying reality of your own death, your pile of mismatched bricks offers zero shelter.
The dark comfort of relativism very quickly turns into paralyzing nihilism.
The lecturer's point is that you cannot actually live consistently as a skeptic or a pure pragmatist.
To function in society, you end up borrowing Christian presuppositions, like the inherent objective value of human life, or the reality of love, or the demand for justice, while simultaneously denying the very foundation those concepts are built upon.
You are living on borrowed capital.
So, you have been on an absolute epic journey of human thought today. You started by realizing the inescapable reality that every single person, including your neighbor, is a practicing philosopher, constantly constructing their own house of knowledge.
You explored the structural pillars of the sciences and the vital critical foundation and constructive worldview roof that philosophy provides to keep them from collapsing.
You navigated the ancient mind-bending tension between the continuous flowing whole of monism and the fragmented, disconnected pixels of atomism.
You witnessed the brilliant internal takedown of Epicurus, proving that treating human beings as mere chemical atoms destroys the very ability to trust human reason.
And you trace the modern intellectual surrender, from Descartes' arbitrary speculations to Kant's inescapable VR goggles, ending in the anti-philosophies of the 20th century that simply gave up the ghost.
It is a sweeping, deeply profound historical narrative that proves one undeniable axiom. Ideas have massive consequences, and foundations truly matter.
So what does this all mean for you right now? It means that these seemingly bizarre, abstract questions of metaphysics and epistemology aren't just parlor games for academics.
They are the exact invisible rules by which our entire society operates today. Systems and your own personal search for meaning in the dark.
You cannot escape philosophy. You can only choose whether you will do it poorly and blindly or do it well, which leaves you with a final, completely different thought to mull over as you walk away.
I'm intrigued.
We have talked entirely about human knowledge failing under the weight of these paradoxes. But we are currently entering an era where we are trying to create artificial minds. We are attempting to program artificial intelligence with ethical guardrails and a logical understanding of reality.
That's a huge undertaking.
It is. If modern human philosophy has given up on answering the big questions and our own societal worldview is fractured into dialectical tension, well, which broken blueprint are we feeding the machine?
That's a great question.
When the AI asks us, what is real? How do you know it? And what is the highest good? Whose unexamined arbitrary rules are we going to hard code into its ultimate foundation? Because a house built on sand will fall, but an artificial mind built on sand might just take us down with it.